Today we're going to talk all about the Superduty Dana 60, what year you want, how to clean it off to get it prepped for your swap truss and get it into your Jeep. Let's check it out. The axle that you're going to want is going to essentially be out of a 2005 up to 2016 Superduty Dana 60. It's either out of an F250 or F350, but you're going to want to make sure it's got a single rear wheel.
You're not that tough.
Even though we're talking about the front, that can make some differences. Now, the reason you don't want anything newer than 2016 is because in 2017, they actually changed the pinion design of this axle. And even though it looks the same and the trusses will all work on your axle, you can't get gears deep enough, at least not at present time, in order to actually make this work in a Jeep like that, or even a Jeep like the CJ I'm building here. Now, there are a couple of ways to identify one of these axles, and one of those is going to be these big radius arm mounts. So you got one here, you have one over there on the other side. The earlier Superduty 60s don't have those. In fact, they were just leaf spring axles, and they'll have leaf spring perches on them. These later axles not only have those radius arm mounts, which of course we're gonna have to cut off, but they also have bigger axle shafts, at least on the outers, better hubs, better locking hubs, stronger C's, axle tubes. This is definitely the axle that you're gonna want. The Superduty 60 also has a ton of aftermarket support. Companies like Artec Industries make really awesome, super high quality truss kits that fit with minimal to no trimming in order to make all your weld gaps correct. They also sell things to make your modern day electronics work with your JK or your JL, keeping this axle extremely serviceable at your local auto parts store when things do fail, and getting you out there on the road without a dash full of lights. But in order to get this axle under your vehicle, you're gonna have to clean it off. So after completely disassembling the axle, brakes, hub bearings, pulling out your axle shaft, and doing that on both sides, you're gonna wanna start cutting it. I'm gonna show you the way here after building a half dozen of these axles, what way works best for me. I'm also gonna do it with simple tools. I'm gonna use nothing more than an angle grinder, maybe a pry bar or two, a little mini sledgehammer. We're gonna use some cutoff discs, some flap wheels, and a reciprocating saw, and get this cleaned off in just a few hours. The driver's side of this axle is actually made out of cast steel. There's not much axle tube exposed. We're gonna have to trim it back to expose more. We'll get to that later. And this whole section is gonna have to be trimmed off here as if it never existed. But cast steel doesn't cut as nice as just regular steel plate. Now this steel, although thick, is gonna come off pretty easily compared to the other side. So you're definitely gonna wanna start with the passenger side. If it's your first time and you start with that driver side, it can fight you a little bit, make you feel pretty defeated pretty quickly, and like you're not really getting anywhere. The first thing I'm gonna attack over here is gonna be this radius arm mount and removing these bushings. Now you can tell because they're flanged, they basically only are gonna come out one way, and that is toward the driver's side. Now you can hammer them out or press them out. It's a lot easier with a grinding wheel. Just cut across here, remove those sections, tap it out with a hammer. Do the same thing on the bottom.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
With those cut off, I'm gonna now use a reciprocating saw, kind of make some slices and cut a lot more of this material off. Something I recommend that's gonna make this a lot easier and save you a bunch of time is good blades. I use these Diablo automotive dismantling blades. They make really quick work of a lot of this steel. and even cut through the cast pretty simply. For my grinding wheels, I use something from Benchmark Abrasives. I use their flap discs, stripping discs, and cutoff wheels because they just work super well, and they're also not that expensive. And at the end of the day, you're gonna wind up using less of them than if you had bought the cheaper stuff. In my experience, you just wind up cutting more efficiently, not spending as much time with dull blades, but trying to squeeze that last little bit of life out of them. And then you go through less of them because they're higher quality. So at the end of the day, you wind up spending about the same amount of money, but you save yourself a bunch of time if you get yourself some decent stuff. Take your time here, don't overheat your blade. After cutting off most of that radius arm mount, removing the shock mount, and then removing the bump stop. So I've probably been working on this axle now for about 30 minutes or so, and that includes me moving around the camera, filming different shots. But at this point, now this is a piece of cast steel on the passenger side. What we're gonna do is actually cut into it, kind of like we did with the radius arm bushings, beat it out with a hammer. Now it's time to remove the rest of the radius arm mount on the passenger side of the axle. Nip away at these welds that hold it onto the axle tube. It's not welded completely all the way around, so I can come in and kind of pie cut it down to the axle tube in a couple of places, grind away at the weld, wiggle it out with a pair of pliers, move on to the next section. Next is gonna be to remove this. The problem with that is that it's cast steel, and the Sawzall blades, even though they're of high quality, they don't like to cut through welds. That really wears down the Sawzall blade pretty quickly. You can either cut through the cast, leave a little bit of it left, and then attack it with a flap wheel and a grinder later, or just go through a couple of blades, deal with it, take your time, and make sure you let your Sawzall cool so you don't overheat it. And it just is what it is. Essentially gonna come in with the Sawzall on an angle, being very careful to not shave down anything out of the axle tube, and just slice it all the way across. All right guys, it's ugly, I'm dirty. Went through a few blades, but we got it done. We'll clean it up with a flap wheel later. We'll fill in any welds where I nicked the axle tubes. You're gonna have to do that no matter what you do to this axle. We're ready to move on with that outer ring. And we're gonna do it just like the radius arm bracket. It's tack welded in places all the way around. We only cut sections of it off to give us enough leverage with pliers to wind up bending it back and forth if there's any of those welds we can't get through. The tricky part with this one is that it's actually welded on the inside toward the center of the axle, but it's also welded on the outside near the C. We're almost done with the passenger side of the tube. And so with that passenger side now clean, all we got to do is get over there, do a little grinding. This side's not all that difficult. This side is cast, okay? So it's going to be a lot harder to cut this off. The Sawzall blades will do it. The grinder will make quicker work of it in areas where it's thin enough to cut with the grinder. But there is a way that I actually do it to speed it up a little bit. And I'm going to show you guys that. I've only learned that from experience, so stay tuned. Make sure you watch to the end. Just like on the passenger side, we're gonna use the reciprocating saw to cut off the shock mount and the sway bar tab. Then use a grinder to remove those sections of the radius arm mounts, pound out those bushings. It's time to get back at it with the reciprocating saw. This stuff can all stay. It's gonna be cut off later all at the same time. You can see that although this is cast, there's a lot of hollow pass-throughs and molding designs in it, which makes it not all super thick. To start, we're just gonna make a slice right down here, down to this portion of the axle tube, kind of separating this section from the diff housing. Then I'm gonna remove the factory bump stop off the top by using my reciprocating saw to follow the curvature of the housing down to the axle tube. Then I come in from the outside straight across and we can remove it. Then remove that large section of the radius arm mount, giving us a little bit more room to access other things and continue to chip away. And we're back. It's a new day, which is one of the benefits of doing this at home on your own time. Obviously, I'm wearing different clothes. You can kind of work on it when you have an opportunity. Now we're to that point where it's gonna either cost you a ton of time or you can save yourself a little bit of time. Here we are. Well, you guys saw earlier that I had the big radius arm mounts. I was chopping them, popping out bushings and removing them. Well, I've trimmed this down, but remember, this is all cast steel, so it's very thick, and your Sawzall blades will work on it, but they'll work very slowly. The cutting torch, if you have one, won't like this. And we need to basically smooth this section out so that it looks like it was never there. That's a huge chunk of very hard metal in order to do that. I have a way that I have learned how to do it with a Sawzall, a hammer, and that grinder, where we're gonna actually get this done pretty simply. So let's get to it and knock this out. Now, the easiest way I've found to do this with basic tools is to make a bunch of vertical cuts from the top to the bottom with your cutoff wheel. You do a bunch of them very close to each other, maybe a 1/4 inch or less apart, being careful not to cut too deep and into the casting, but to follow the curvature of the axle tube from top to bottom. Then once you're finished with those, you're gonna come back and make horizontal cuts, the same thing, 1/4 inch or less apart, all the way across from top to bottom. So with all those waffle cuts now in there, like you just saw me do, I'm gonna basically come down from the top, just start knocking little chunks of that steel off. Guys, I've only been at this now with all these lines for less than 10 minutes. It's taken me 2 grinding wheels. I'm still in the second one, and now we're gonna start hacking away at it and just watch all that big, thick, chunky steel just fall right off. Because you're making these cuts on a rounded axle tube, you constantly have to be changing the angle of your cutoff wheel. Cutoff wheels don't like to bend, so removing it in small chunks, allowing yourself to adjust your angle, prevents you from putting that weird pressure on your grinding wheel, wind up breaking it. It also makes really quick work of all that thick steel. Now, once you have the driver's side radius arm mount, all that cast ugliness cut off of there, it's a really good time to actually remove this section of the casting around the axle tube that you're gonna need to. You guys saw what my strategy was here. In fact, you can still see some of the marks where I wasn't able to get all the way in just yet. That's no big deal. We can attack it later, especially after this piece is gone. Now notice, I still haven't removed this section here, and that's because after this piece is removed, it's gonna be a lot easier to get in there and cut those welds all the way around and remove this bracket. But this section of casting, we're gonna have to remove 2 inches of it. Now, don't be overly concerned. We are gonna be removing some of these plug welds, but there are still a couple of plug welds on the inside that we're not removing that are gonna still give it some strength. Then of course, you're adding your truss, which is gonna be welded both to the cast as well as to the axle tube, giving it even more strength. And then we're gonna weld that axle tube all the way around the casting and the remaining casting that's there to give it the rest of the strength that it needs. If you do all those things properly and you weld to the cast properly, which I'll show you how to do in a future video, you'll have no reason to think that your axle tube won't stay where it's supposed to stay. Right now, we're gonna measure in 2 inches. I'm gonna put a dot. I'm gonna move another 2 inches, put another dot. I'm just gonna connect the dots, and then I'm slowly gonna cut with my grinding wheel all the way around, being careful not to cut too deep. After cutting all the way around, making a couple of pie cuts to get that first section out. All right, there we go. So that's how thick this section of cast was here. We're essentially doing okay as far as getting in there. I barely nicked the axle tubes making this slice, so that tells me that my judgment on how deep I'm going is okay. Now that we have this section pie cut out, we're gonna continue all the way around, start popping it off. Now remember guys, mild steel will bend. Cast steel is a lot harder, it does not like to. So sometimes getting in there with a screwdriver or something like a chisel, being able to bend it away and then hitting it with the hammer to bend it back, will make much quicker work of breaking off these sections. There we go. Got a big chunk of that cast off, and we can go right around. See, it even broke the plug weld off. Still looks okay from that side, but it's broken on the bottom there. So with the giant mess on the garage floor, we're able to basically shave everything off of this and shape it a little bit. I was able to avoid cutting into the axle tube, which was really nice. Now it's time to use one of those stripper discs, clean off this axle. As you guys can see here, that stripping disc from Benchmark Abrasives makes really quick work of cleaning up this axle. I basically use it to clean up every single part of it except for the diff cover, which we're not going to reuse, and get it ready for that truss. That is all there is to it. Cleaning one of these axles in your garage at home with a cutoff wheel, with some flap discs, with a stripping disc, and a reciprocating saw. Obviously, we used a big hammer, but cheap, affordable tools that most of you probably have in your garage. And this axle is definitely ready for a truss. Guys, it's really not all that difficult, and you can do it with not all that much effort in your own garage if you follow the steps here that I gave you on how to cut it up. So guys, make sure you stick around and watch this axle come to life for this CJ build. It's gonna be awesome, and we're gonna do some really cool things with Artec Industries and get this CJ on some 43s. Anyway guys, make sure you subscribe, share this with your friends. Stick around, next video is coming soon.